Are you religious? Do you faithfully worship God? Are you devoted to God? Are you religious? As you saw this title in your bulletin or on the screen before the service, maybe you answered it in your head. Are you religious? Well, before we can answer that question, we really should define what it actually means to be religious. What does it look like if one is devoted to God? That is what our two verses answer for us, or at least begin to answer for us this morning in the book of James. But before we consider these two verses, I want to just remind us of where we've been in the book of James so far. As if you've been with us the last 2 weeks, we've taken our passages out of order, so I want to just review what we've seen in the book of James so far, as this week we get back on track in the order in which James writes. But we've seen so far that James, Jesus' brother, opens his letter by addressing those who have been scattered, those who have been persecuted from their faith, and they've been spread out over the world. And he begins by addressing their suffering, their persecution, and he speaks of the many trials that they're going through, that they can go through, and he calls them to have joy, to be glad in the midst of hardship due to the way God uses these things to grow them in their faith. And he continues on with this thought of suffering, of persecution, of hardship, and he addresses not only the joy that they should have, but further, he calls them to rely upon God, to pray for wisdom, and ask such questions as, what should I do? How should I live in the midst of my suffering? We've seen James has reversed the way that we would normally view riches, and he shows what it truly means to be rich, and that is having a relationship with God. He sets us straight on what we should value, what we should prioritize, what we should treasure, worldly riches or spiritual riches. James calls the one blessed, privileged, in a favorable position as they go through suffering. Why? Or how can you be blessed in suffering? Well, if you remain firm in your faith, you'll receive a crown of life, eternal life. James has addressed temptation and sin. He gives great warnings concerning these things, and he has shown us that God is not to blame one bit for your temptation, for your sin. You can't blame God and say he's caused this. But James has shown us what we can blame on God, and that is causing us to be born again, causing us to be born again to new spiritual life, that we can live apart from sin because of God. James has called us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, things that we struggle to do. And he's shown us how we can accomplish these things, and that's by listening to the Word of God. Not just listening with our ears and forgetting what we've heard, but James calls us to hear it, to remember it, to meditate on it, and then to do it. That is what James has covered in this letter so far. And we come to the next two verses, the two verses that end chapter 1, and these are the two verses that come right after the section that speaks of being doers of the word and not hearers only. And we're going to see in these two verses, James really shows what we are to do. He shows what we must do as people that have faith in Jesus Christ. And he comes at it from a slightly different angle, or he brings up something he hasn't talked about yet, and that is religion, or being religious. So our theme for James 1:26 through 27 is easily forgotten or easily ignored components to one's devotion to God. Easily forgotten or easily ignored components to one's devotion to God. So look with me again at these two verses, and I want to address them first in just a general sense, and I want us to see this religious or religion component that James now brings into his letter. So I want us to think about these two verses in a general sense, and then we'll really get to the specifics. So look again at the two verses, and notice with me the words religious and religion. He says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. We have the word religious mentioned once, and then the word religion twice. And what James is speaking of here with these words is being devoted, worshiping, revering something. And especially these words speak of outward acts, okay? Things that can be seen, things that are shown to express one's devotion. It's speaking of religious practice, what is done to honor a God. This word is a word that was used in a general sense to speak of many different religions or many different religions that worship different gods. And James, of course, is addressing one religion or one devotion to God, and that is to the one true and only God. As he says in verse 27, if you look with me there, he says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father. So he's talking about religion or being religious in the sense of being devoted to the one true and only God. And James speaks of being religious or having reverence of God in a particular way. He speaks of this being free from corruption, being free from moral guilt. As he says again in verse 27, he says, religion that is pure and undefiled. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God. These two words, pure and undefiled, they're very similar, and they speak of what I said, free from corruption, free from sin, being free from moral guilt. And the idea, I believe, is that James is saying this religion is not just ritual or going through the motions in a religious worship service or carrying out things that are often associated with worship, like singing, like coming to church, like taking communion. It is not these things, and then your life is filled with sin. You follow your sinful desires. You neglect things you should be doing. You live in disobedience. This isn't the religion James is talking about. The religion he's talking about affects both how one conducts himself in a religious worship service like this and how they conduct themselves outside of it. It affects how you worship in a Sunday morning worship service and at work and at home this week. It affects how you worship tonight in the Sunday evening service and as you live your life this week. So in these two verses, James is talking about true religion, true devotion, what it looks like to correctly and what it looks like to genuinely worship our God. James is answering, what does it mean to be religious? What does it look like to be truly devoted to God? And an older word might not mean much to some, but it might mean a lot to others. What does it mean to be pious? And just one more thing I want to say about these words, religious and religion, and really just the whole passage, is that James defines these things, or he shows what it looks like. We should know that these are not the only things that need to be done. So James is going to mention three things in specific, and we shouldn't look at this passage and say, that's all that we need in worship. That's all that we need to be truly devoted to God. But these three things are things that need to be done. These three things are involved in true devotion to God, but this is not what makes up religion or devotion to God in its entirety. There's more. True religion or true devotion to God manifests itself in a lot of different ways. But these three things, I believe, are mentioned because James is going to use them as a springboard to jump off and talk more about and command them and give them more detail about in the rest of the letter. But then secondly, I believe James brings these things up here and in the rest of the letter because they're easily missed. They're easily things as Christians that we miss, we don't do. So you can think you are religious, you can think that you are living a devoted life to God, and these three things that James brings up here are absent. You can think you're religious, but these are absent. And this morning, may God show us if this is the case for us. So let's look at these three things that James lays out and says this is true devotion. These things you need to do if you want to have true devotion to God. And the first thing that James has us consider is that a true devotion involves controlling your mouth. Look with me at James 1:26. He says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. So James begins speaking about religion in a negative way. Okay, the next two components he'll speak of in a positive way. But here, James 1:26, James begins by saying, if anyone thinks he's religious, if anyone thinks he's devoted to God, if anyone thinks he's faithfully worshiping God, and then he brings up this first component of true devotion, and that is concerning the words that come out of your mouth. Okay, as James says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue. James speaks of bridling your tongue, which is a very graphic image relating to the tongues or the mouths of a horse. Okay, he relates our tongue to an animal that needs to be controlled. Our tongues are wild. Just like a horse that is not fully tamed, it needs to be harnessed. There needs to be a bridle that is put on it to be used to control it, to be able to steer it in a certain direction that you desire to go, to maybe stop it from going in a certain place. So too our tongues need to be controlled. Okay, they need to be directed. They need to be stopped at times from speaking. A horse without a bridle may take off. It may lead its rider and itself into danger. It may cause pedestrians harm. If the tongue is let loose and it can take off wherever it wishes, great danger can come from it. You or others or both may be seriously harmed. What a picture of our words, and what I'd say James is trying to bring out is the wild nature of them. Just like a horse that is not fully tamed. Our tongues are wild. They need to be controlled. They need to be restrained. They need to be held in check, just like a horse or just like an animal does. And James's point, though, is as we are talking about religion and who truly is devoted to the Lord, the one who does not exercise self-control when it comes to the things that they say, then they are not living in true devotion to God. James shows this in two ways if you look back with me at verse 26. He says in verse 26, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, and then he says this, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. He deceives his heart, and this person's religion is worthless. This is how James makes his point that this person is not truly religious. This is how James makes his point that true devotion to God involves a control of the tongue. And I want to consider each of these separately. The first, again, was that he deceives his heart, which literally means he misleads himself. Okay, to deceive one's heart is to mislead yourself. And this isn't the first time that James has spoken of a self-deception, of deceiving yourselves. If you look back with me at James 1, verses 16 through 17. James 1, 16 through 17, we see this self-deception. He says, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Do not be deceived, my brothers. Then a couple verses down, if you look with me at James 1:22, James 1:22 says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. In these two passages, and then in our own passage, three different Greek words are being used to speak of this deceiving, or this self-deception, as I called it. But all three are very similar to speak of being led astray, of being fooled, of lying. And in each of these contexts, I believe, as we look at the verses around it, I believe James is talking about lying to oneself. It's not someone lying to you and leading you astray, but you're lying to yourself. You're deceiving yourself. It's self-deception. You're fooling yourself. You're leading yourself astray. It's not that false teachers are coming in and they're preaching heresy to these Christians. It isn't that someone is taking you by the hand and leading you astray, but it's that you're taking your own hand and you're leading yourself, or you're misleading yourself down a self-deceptive path. You're walking yourself into a lie. And here the thought is, James is saying, you think you're religious when you're really not. Okay, you're telling yourself that you're faithful, you're devoted, you're doing what God wants you to do, when you're really not. You're ignoring, you're disobeying God, and it amounts to you thinking that you are worshiping God, say by coming to church or genuinely singing praises to God. You're attentive, listening to the messages, you're giving tithes, and then you walk out these doors and you verbally make fun of what someone did at church. Or you're saying later in the week to someone that worshiped with you, did you see what she was wearing at church? It looked hideous. Or maybe you're at a meeting, you're at a committee meeting, and you let loose, you let your anger get the best of you, and you speak words of anger to someone that disagrees with you. James is saying you're lying to yourself if you think you're religious, as your words certainly don't show it. The second way James says that our words have much to do with our devotion and worship to God is by saying that their supposed devotion is useless. If you look back with me at verse 26, he says again, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Connected to the first way that he showed, that this is not true devotion when he says deceives his heart. Now he says this person's religion is worthless. And he's saying this person's religion is useless. It's empty, it's fruitless, it's lacking truth. That's what the word worthless means. James is saying this is not true religion. This is not worshiping God. This is not what it looks like to be devoted to God. And I believe James is making the same point as he made as we saw last week. If you look with me at chapter 2 now. Look with me at James chapter 2, verse 14. James 2, verse 14 said, What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? So he spoke of true saving faith. He spoke of true saving faith must result in works, that you must believe in Jesus Christ and have a life that is transformed into a life that lives for God. And James says in verse 14, if you don't have works, if you don't have this life that's transformed, is this true saving faith? Are you saved? And he implies the answer, no. So here James is saying that they may think they're worshiping God, but they're not. They may believe that they are devoted to God, but they are not. And now I should say before some of us begin panicking that if you're not controlling your words, okay, if you let your words reign free, you might think, does this mean I'm not a Christian? Okay, not necessarily, but I think what James is getting at is we should think twice about this. It should make you realize that you are not living as God called you to. Something needs to change. So I'd ask us after this first thing that James mentions that is involved in true devotion, I'd ask us to consider, how concerned are you about your words? How concerned are you about your words? Are you often struck with guilt and regret about the things that you say? Hey, you say something wrong and it gets to you. You realize that was sinful. Okay, you apologize. You ask for forgiveness. Or do you just say whatever you want with no regret? You don't think before you speak. Whatever comes to mind is out without a second thought. James is addressing things like gossip, insults, cursing, lying, hurtful words, even joking words that are really belittling, words that are complaining or grumbling. And he's saying these things need to be restrained. Our words must be held in check. And I'd ask you to consider, if you're doing so, how concerned are you about the things that you say? Is this important to you? And James is saying it should be. Okay, it's vital. It's a vital part of your religion. It's a vital part of your worship to God. It's a vital part to being a Christian. A Christian must have a transformed mouth. It should scare us that James says that the one who does not bridle his tongue, their religion is worthless. Talk about seeing your words as something that is important, something you should be cared about. James surely does. God surely does. And today, if you haven't, if you are truly a Christian, you will as well. You'll see your words as important. What comes out of your mouth really matters, is what James is getting at. The second thing that true devotion to God involves is caring for and helping the needy. Look with me at James 1:27. He says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. So James speaks of our words, and now he goes in a pretty different direction. Okay, he's off of words now, and he's on to action, on to doing something, and he addresses people in need. And that specifically is, he says, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. To visit here means more than just stopping in to see someone. When we think about visiting, we might think about showing up at someone's house or maybe talking with someone after church. But here, there's a lot more to visit than just checking in or seeing how someone's doing just with your words. But he's speaking of having helpful intent. Okay, he makes me think of what we saw last week in James 2. Okay, James 2, verses 15 through 16 said, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? Here by James saying visit, he's not speaking of just a peripheral checking in or mere words, but it's a desire to really help. It's a desire to really assist. It's actually providing for their needs. And the specific groups that he talks about here are orphans and widows. James speaks of helping two groups, kids without parents and wives who have lost their husband. He speaks of their need or their situation when he says in their affliction. He's speaking of them being in distress, the needs and even the oppression that they may face. As we think back to James's day especially, these would have been people that would have been in an extremely tough situation, okay, as there weren't government programs to assist them and they couldn't provide for themselves. And as we think about our times, certainly times have changed. Okay, men don't die as early, normally, or on average, as they did back then, and even wives can more easily work to provide for themselves. And for orphans, there's government assistance set up in very organized and very helpful ways. But with all of this said, I don't believe we can just write off what James says here. I don't think we can come to this second thing and say, doesn't apply to us anymore, move on to the third. But rather, I think it still does apply. I don't believe we can say that they are not still in need today. Okay, those who have lost their spouse, widows or widowers, they've lost their spouse, the one who they've been married to, the one that they've lived with and done life with for many years. They're experiencing a whole new life. They may not have had to do certain things when their spouse was alive because they did them and now they have to do them. They may be emotionally distraught. They may have real needs. This is still the case today, and James calls us to visit them, to assist them, to reach out to them and ask, what can I help you with? As we think about the church, okay, maybe your mind kind of goes in this direction. We have deacons that do this, okay, and it's not necessarily right on display for all to see, but I get to see some of those inner workings or behind the scenes with our deacons, and they do serve our widows and our widowers very faithfully within the church. They care for those who have lost a spouse. But interestingly enough, if we look at our passage, it's not the deacons that are the only ones directed here, and rather they're not even mentioned. It's all Christians. It's all Christians that are given the call to reach out to widows here at church. After their spouse has died and they come back to church, okay, especially if they don't have family in the church, to offer to sit with them in a church service, okay, as they used to sit with their spouse and they're no longer there. It's all Christians that are given the call to offer to do yard work for a widow from church. It's all Christians that should reach out to widows even outside of the church doors. If you have a neighbor who loses their spouse, maybe to invite them over for dinner, to shovel their driveway when it snows, to rake their leaves. It's all Christians that are called to care for and assist widows. I think this applies as well to widowers. That is part of being religious. Now orphans. We certainly still have orphans today. According to PA Department of Human Services, there are approximately 15,000 children in the foster care system in Pennsylvania. According to adoptuskids.org, there are approximately 3,000 children waiting to be adopted in PA. Those numbers are just PA, okay? It doesn't include the whole United States. It doesn't include the whole world. The numbers of orphans, when we look at them, are staggering. These are kids without parents. These are kids without a set home. And again, as we think about our church, okay, our church has a Children's Hope Committee that falls under the deacons, which does Operation Christmas Child and Angel Tree Ministries, and these certainly minister to orphans. But again, our passage today is calling us as individual Christians to care for and assist orphans. It's a call for all Christians. This is a text that I believe should cause us to think long and hard about fostering and adopting children. This is a text that should cause us to pray to God. Say, God, show me, give me wisdom if this is a direction that I should go, if we as a family should foster or adopt. This is a text that should cause us to get involved in some way in ministering to orphans. Can you imagine growing up without parents, without a loving, nurturing, providing home? That is the life of orphans. That is why they're needy. That is why James includes them here in being devoted to God. There's another reason that James includes this here, or this is part of the Christian religion, or worshiping God. And as we think about what James says here, as we look at this command, it might seem like an outlier. As you think about your Bibles and you think, where's this addressed in the Bible? Your mind, since we're right here, might only come to this passage. But interestingly enough, what James brings up here is no new command. This is no new value when it comes to faith with God, but it originates all the way back at the heart of God. Psalm 68, verses 4 through 6 says this: "Sing to God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts. His name is the Lord. Exalt before him, Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in a parched land." So this originates not just with James, but with the very heart of God. I won't read it for sake of time, but this is something that God made a priority and commanded for Israel. Okay, Deuteronomy 24, 17 through 22, God makes provision for them to leave over crops and things to provide for the fatherless and the widow. This was something that was the constant drumbeat of the prophets, both major and minor. It comes up again and again and again in the prophets. I could go to Jesus, and I could go to Paul. Caring for the needy, caring for widows and orphans has always been part of a walk with God. So I could have brought us to many other passages, but I want to mention just one more, and I think it is extremely fitting with what James says here, and I think is a pretty similar message to what we find here in James. And that is in the book of Amos. Okay, in Amos 5, 21 through 24, we get both a consideration of what we think of as formal or maybe ritual religion or worship of God, and it's connected, it's related to a care for the needy. Listen to what God says through the prophet Amos in Amos 5, 21 through 24. It might be shocking. He says, I despise your feasts. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. So I'll pause there, and then I'll get to verse 24. This is like God saying to us, I hate your Sunday morning services. I will not look upon your acts of service at church. Stop singing to me your hymns and your praise songs. God said that to us. That would be a shock. Like, whoa. And I think that's how Amos's audience was probably feeling it. And this is why God says it. Okay, he says this in verse 24. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. He's saying, you do these things, okay? You worship me, you keep feasts, you bring sacrifices, and yet you're not upholding justice. You're not upholding righteousness. Earlier in the book, and as I said, the other prophets, they're mistreating the poor. Okay? They're not caring for the orphans and the widows, but rather they're oppressing them. So God is saying, show justice and righteousness. Care for the needy. Stop trampling and crushing them. Act rightly. Treat others kindly. Look out for the poor. That is why God rejected their formal worship, because they were oppressing the needy. They were not only overlooking them, but they were actually hurting them. They had formal worship of God while they were sinning against others, and God rejected that worship. He said, that is not true religion. That is not true worship. And very similar to the James passage we find now, as James is talking about true religion, true worship of God, it's not only rituals, it's not only worship service, but includes if you visit orphans and widows. And I'd ask you simply this morning, are you? Are you doing what James says here in the second thing he lists? If you're not, then James would say you're lacking something major in your devotion to God. God may say, stop singing to me while you take advantage of the needy around you, while you just walk right by them at school and you see they're in need of help, while you walk right by them at church without a care in the world for them. The third thing that James brings up concerning true devotion to God is not falling into the ways of this world. Look with me at James 1:27. This is what he concludes with. James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Then this is his third thing, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Okay, by the world, James is speaking of the values, the practices, the lifestyles, the beliefs of the world, of non-Christians that are against God and his word. If you would follow them, you would be committing or partaking in sin and disobedience to God. And the command given here is keep oneself unstained from it, to guard, to preserve oneself from falling into or starting to practice or participate in the sins that the world commits, that they don't see as wrong, but really are. That is what James is driving at by saying to keep oneself unstained from the world. And as we think about this, it can be so tempting. Okay? It can be so drawing. It can seem like the life. You may be drawn because of the friends that you could have. And a point we can draw out from this third item that James mentions is that James is saying that being religious is not only done at church. It's not only done when you're among Christians, but being religious includes when you're out in the world, when you're working amongst non-Christians, when you're going to school or college with them, when you're at a family function with them. Being devoted to God must be carried out there as well. This verse is not saying that we should never interact with the world or befriend non-Christians. Jesus says this in the high priestly prayer in John 17:14-16. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. That's what we have here in James. Not that we are to be out of the world, but as we are in it, we are not to be of it. As James says, we are not to be stained by it, not conforming to how the world speaks or acts or thinks. I think this can apply to all of us in this room. Okay? As we go out these doors, we are entering that world. Adults can struggle with this, but the area I want to address for application is especially the teens in middle and high school, for the juniors, seniors, as they prepare to go off to college, even the college students. You probably feel the pull towards the world may be the greatest in this room. The draw to be popular or just fit in, the draw to have fun, the draw of the world at your age is strong and extremely tempting. And I want to give you an example, and really, again, it's an example for all of us of what James says here in verse 27, I think an extremely relatable example, and that is the example of Daniel. Daniel, the character in the Bible. The Babylonian Empire went into the land of Israel and they took young men. Okay, they went into the land of the kingdom of Judah and they took young men, they ripped them away from their families, they took them to Babylon and they trained them, they taught them. They were immersed in the Babylonian Empire and the Babylonian ways, and they sought to conform them to the ways of Babylon. And Daniel was one of them. His story is laid out in the book of Daniel, and Daniel was one of them. He was away from parents, which the age group that I just spoke about, kids in middle, high school, college, preparing to go to college, definitely can relate to. But Daniel was in an ungodly world. Right in the beginning of the book of Daniel, we're told that he has a choice to make. Will he eat the king's food, or will he refuse, as he saw it, as going against God's law, that he would be disobeying God by eating the king's food? Will he give into ungodly ways or follow godly ways and potentially pay the price? The king's food was certainly good. It would have certainly been appetizing to Daniel. He would have fit in with the crowd. He would have looked good in the eyes of superiors. But Daniel 1:8 says this: "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." It's going directly against the king's command. This could have cost him his life. But verse 8 there, when it says Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, it's being unstained from the world. Daniel's being an example of what James talks about, of being unstained from the world, not being corrupted by the world, not falling into or doing the practices of the world. Later in the book of Daniel, his three friends would do something similar that also would cost them their lives. So teens, college students, this is hard. It's not the most appetizing way. You may lose friends. You may seem like a rule follower, but this is what it looks like to be devoted to God. It's the way that pays off. So we see this third component, that true devotion to God involves how you live outside of these doors. You worship God when you do not give in to the temptations the world offers, or the things they value, or the practices that they see as normal, as natural, as totally okay, that go against God and His Word. We live in a world that pressures us to fall into its mold, but we are called to resist and to live a life that is devoted to God. So James has given us three specific components that are involved in true devotion to God. Things I'd argue that as you think about these are easily forgotten. These are things that we think easily don't count as part of our religion or our worship of God. These things are controlling your mouth, caring for the needy, and not falling into the ways of the world. So I'd ask you as we close our message what I did to open it. Are you religious? Are you religious? A true devotion is not less than, but it is a whole lot more than just showing up to a church service weekly or singing songs or praying. But we see from this passage in James that true devotion involves how we speak, how we relate to others, and how we live our lives. Let's make sure and let's be willing to change today. If we claim to be devoted to God, then let's actually be in the way God lays out. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you would help us as a church, help us as individual Christians, as people that claim to be devoted, claim to be faithful, claim to worship you. Lord, I pray that you would help us to actually and genuinely, and even how your word lays out, to truly worship you and be devoted to you. Lord, I pray that our worship our living in devotion to you would not only be within this room or only when we're around other Christians, but Lord, I pray that our worship, our devotion would also take place outside of these doors. Lord, that it would take place within our lives, that would take place in the way that we speak. Help us to restrain our words. Lord, I pray that we would be devoted to you in the way that we relate to others, that our heart would go out to the poor, the needy, to orphans and widows, that we would think about their situation and realize how in need they are. Lord, I pray that you would pull our hearts in their direction. And Lord, I pray that our devotion would also be lived out in the way that we live our lives, our lifestyle, that we wouldn't conform to the ways of the world, to sinful ways, but Lord, rather help us to conform our ways to you and to your word. Lord, there's many other ways in which we can be devoted to you. I pray that you would make us aware of them, that we'd be people that would seek to follow you and your word completely and wholly. Lord, I pray that you would help us to truly and genuinely and sincerely worship you. And in your name I pray. Amen.